Okay, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to Professor Michel Pache, who is a Professor of Global Studies at Roskilde University in Denmark, and who is also an Associate Fellow at Chatham House in London. And Michel is a real authority in the field of EU foreign policy, and in particular, EU's relations with the Middle East and North Africa, for lack of a better indication of the region that and the relations that she's going to talk to us about today. She's going to touch also on the wider issue of the European neighborhood policy, the war in Ukraine, what it all means for our relations with the neighbors. So Michel, we're very pleased to have you with us today. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Gergana, and I hope you can clearly hear me. And also thank you to Assam for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you a couple of reflections that I'm constantly having about the development of relations with the Middle East and North Africa by the EU, or the so-called EU and the Middle East. And as you can see from the cover of this presentation, we have just, together with my colleagues Daniela Huber and Dimitri Bouris, just launched the Routledge Handbook of EU-Middle East Relations, which brings together a number of well-informed pieces and nuanced pieces on these relations. And there's also a contribution by Assam in this on EU-Lebanese relations. So what I'm going to try and do today is to try and reflect a little bit about what we call in the handbook these entanglements, historical entanglements in these relations. But also, to do justice to this, I will go through the ruptures that have been ongoing in the past decades, and then we'll come to the more contemporary context of the ongoing war in Ukraine, and also what the implications of this war are, not only for the eastern neighbors, but also for the southern neighbors. And I open, of course, the floor for interested students, especially to, turn these puzzles into further extensions of more broader issues that we are faced with today. So first and foremost, I want to emphasize that the handbook brings together a number of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. So we're not only looking at this from a purely political science perspective, but we bring in historians and anthropologists and sociologists, but also people who have actually been working in the policy-making field, which I think is quite important, especially nowadays, to have this dialogue between policymakers and academia, when academia is under so much strain as to whether we actually need the social sciences in order to improve the world out there. So what we attempted to do is to try to bring together a recollection of the legacies of Europe in the Middle East.
Could you please turn down? Could you please mute yourself? Someone's recorder is on very loudly. Thank you. Thank you.
That's okay. We need a bit of music in the background. So what we're trying to do in the handbook is to bring in a number of recollections and references to the legacies of what especially European colonialism has left in the Middle East and North African region. But I'm saying this because I am extremely critical of the notions of Europe and the EU, but also the Middle East and North Africa. So this is something that maybe we can take in the Q&A. But just for reference now, as we go on with this conversation, I would like to say that the handbook itself quizzes the notions that we are using in place today. So what is the purpose of this handbook? The larger objective of the handbook is to really try to decenter, but also recenter the significance of those tools we have in academia, especially the theoretical, but also the empirical tools we have, to study contexts that are not necessarily European or They are European in terms of legacies, but when we look at them in terms of culture in particular, we know that they are not cognizant completely of what we are used to in the European context. So in this case, we are trying to embed ourselves and nuance ourselves more in the Middle East and North African space. And this will require us to not only appreciate the geographical space that is close to Europe, but also the cultural significance of this region, the social relations, the economic and also political reference points. And in particular, we have an agency-centered approach, which means that we try to look at these entanglements between Europe and the Middle East and North Africa from the point of view of the people that these entanglements affect, that is the people of the Middle East and North Africa. So when we talk about these issues, we are of course talking not only about cultural, social, economic and political issues, but we're touching upon the politics of identity that are inherent in discursive practices about the region, especially in EU discourses. So in a way, we have multiple levels that we operate on in the handbook that are national, regional, but also international. And we try to do this also through alternative epistemologies. That means that as students of these spaces, we need as many methods and mixed methods as possible in order to comprehend and to come close to understanding this context as much as we can. So I'll just give you one example. If we focus on the issue of migration, which is a very important part of EU entanglement with the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in the context in which we see the, I would say, very selective selective support of Ukrainian refugees in Europe today, we know that there's a particular discourse about refugees or those seeking safety away from war coming from the Middle East or North Africa, which is very different in the way in which we support Ukrainian refugees, for example, coming to Europe today. Please don't get me wrong. I want to emphasize that all humans who are fleeing from war should be supported and should be offered safety, in our spaces in Europe. But there is an inherent selective support for those who are closer to us culturally as we deem them to be. And there is an inherent racist, but also specifically anti-Muslim sentiment when we deal with people seeking asylum, for example, from Afghanistan or from Syria. And I live in a country where even the legal parameters upon which one can seek asylum have changed radically over these years to reflect an inherently biased and racist policy. So these are the kind of things that I want to bring to the pool today, so we can discuss a little bit more what the MENA region means today for Europe, but also what Europe signifies for the people of the Middle East and North Africa today. So we split these, what we call raptures in the handbook, into a number, and we do this historically through periods in history. When we talk about raptures, we're talking about specific moments in time when what we deem to be paradoxes and contradictions become particularly evident. So for instance, if the EU assumes that if the MENA region develops economically, then political change will come about. So when something happens in the Middle East and North Africa, like the Arab Spring, and that promised political change does not come about, what does it tell us in terms of the EU's policy? So what appears to be harmonious relations over a number of decades suddenly experience a breach. So what we try to argue in the handbook is that these are the specific moments in time when those that have been silenced are exposed. So what the people of the region really desire was exposed through various protests across the Arab world. And this is important because it shines a deeper light on the real interests of the European Union, in particular in the Middle East and North Africa. So just very briefly, I'll go through these raptures, starting with what we call Rapture 1, which is the end of the Second World War. So as most of us know, it was then that the world was divided into the East and the West. And in particular, when we zoom in on Europe and Middle East relations, we talk about the decolonization, or at least the start of the decolonization process of the Middle East and North African countries. So this kind of disentanglement from the legacy of Europe's colonialism over such a long period of time. But of course, we can argue that in some specific spaces, as in Palestine, for instance, this process has never really materialized because there's a particular settler colonial enterprise that is still entrenched in the case of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. We move then to Rupture 2, when, as I mentioned already, the Palestinian issue has been quite important for some time in EU relations with the Middle East and North Africa. But we have a number of wars, not least the 1967 and 1973 wars, and also the end of what we call pan-Arabism. But we have an economic crisis, which is largely referred to as the oil crisis. And these ruptures made the EU zoom in its attention to the region by way of starting to look at the region as a whole rather than through bilateral relations. And the first such regional policy was called the Global Mediterranean Policy, where the EU was still figuring out what kind of economic relations would be deemed appropriate for those partners that are neighboring the EU, but not necessarily eligible for membership. So we then have an important declaration, which is called the Venice Declaration, where the self-determination of the Palestinian people was acknowledged by the Europeans in 1980. So this is something that shows us that the EU, leaving aside for the moment the American input into the Middle East so-called peace process, had a voice to be reckoned with, that Europeans were trying to voice their own position on this very important issue in the region. So then we move to Rupture 3, which brings us to 1989 and 1990, which for those of you studying the Eastern neighborhood is quite a critical, important delineation, which is of course the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then of course, at the same time in the southern region, we have the invasion in Iraq. But while we have this intervention, we also have the initiation of the Oslo Accords and the Middle East peace process, as it's called. And then in 1995, we have the Barcelona Declaration, or the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which I'm sure you will hear more about this week in your lectures. So we rapidly move to Rupture 4, which brings us to the period of the 2000s. And here, unfortunately, we see an intensification of American and European military presence in the Middle East and North Africa, not least in the Persian Gulf, and of course in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have to remember that these particular military interventions have left a huge scar on the region in terms of the people's perception of external intervention in their own areas. But on the other hand, we had something quite important happening, and that is the ongoing dialogue with Iran in terms of the Joint Comprehension Plan of Action. But at the same time, we have something quite important, because George W. Bush deemed specific countries in this region to be axis of evil, and also the initiation of the so-called war on terror. So overall, this is a period, for those of you of a younger generation, you probably know this period the most, but this is the start, we can argue, of a rapid acceleration of what we deem to be Western securitization of the Middle East or North Africa, where the region is deemed to be highly unstable, highly insecure, prone to terrorism, and therefore something of an emergency nature needs to be done about it. So there is a particular take on the manner in which we in Europe perceive the region out there in the south. We now move to Rupture 5, which brings us to the Arab uprisings in 2010-2011, and of course the importance of political Islam. So while we see a desire by the Arab people for first and foremost bread, but also dignity and of course a better economic life, we also have of course the rise of some global powers, I should argue, in the region itself. So Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but also Israel, in comparison, of course, to Iran, where there is this tension, this rising tension in the fear of Iran as a nuclear power. So we see these rapid ruptures continuing to fuel more and more conflicts, which brings us to the disastrous humanitarian crisis that we have in Yemen up to this day. Of course, the ongoing crisis in Syria, but also in Libya, and the ongoing crisis in Gaza in particular, but the relationship between Israel and Palestine is now giving us a new momentum in terms of the US, moving away from its attention of the Middle East, but also the Europeans have been quite silent on the issue of Palestine in particular. So we would argue that the EU has failed to adopt any meaningful role. If we go back to the idea of the Venice Declaration, when the EU had quite an important role to play. So just a quick sum up of these ruptures. What we deem these ruptures to signify is that these are really moments of truth, which expose the EU's not only vulnerabilities, but also the fallacies that it has some role to play in the Middle East and North Africa. So this is more and more important because it tells us as students and as people who are working to produce knowledge about the region that something imminent is happening that requires multiple tools in order to understand all that is going on at the same time. This is quite a lot to take on for analysts, but also those who would like a better understanding of the region. So we kind of bring all these ruptures together by summing up some inherent paradoxes and contradictions that we see in the manner in which the EU perceives the region and continues to devise policy towards the region when it does. Let me say that for many of the policies of the EU towards the Middle East and North Africa, we've often had the EU reacting to what it deems to be crisis moments. There has been very little by way of initiation that has come outside a crisis moment. So this is important to keep in mind. So I would argue that if we are serious about understanding as much as possible the Middle East and North Africa as educators and students, we need to try and supersede any construction of the Middle East and Europe itself by really immersing ourselves as subjects, which means that we are open to listen for the people of the region to tell us what it is like to be an active citizen under, let's say, an ongoing authoritarian regime, and what it is to be living in an economic situation which gives you, a kind of GDP under the poverty line. These are the kind of voices that we really need to bring to the table here. So we need to turn our focus on which important and key sites are we looking in terms of producing knowledge, not least in our classrooms. And that's where I would vouch for an introspective exploration, where we are open to those students in particular who come from the region to European classrooms and see what they have to say. And equally for more of our European students to go to the region and be open to learning what it is like to study in a university in the Middle East and North Africa, where the educational policy may be quite different from that we are used to in European universities. So our hope is that the handbook will create this kind of platform where teachers and students come together to create learning communities. And we are focusing on trying to research with rather than research on, and learning with rather than learning on, and also to teach with rather than teach on. And these are important terms for us because we are very much part of this new turn now in international relations, where we really wish the handbook to place itself as part of the decentering agenda in knowledge production. So let's have a look at what this means for our study of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, just for those of you who are interested, Paola Rivetti and Francesco Cavatorta just published a very interesting special issue in the Italian international relations journal called PACO, Partecipazione and Conflitto. And here they zoom in on what revolution and counter-revolution in the Middle East and North Africa really means for the people of the region. So one of the key questions that was posed, and I was a contributor to this special issue together with Mohammed Shahad and Ziad Abu Mustafa from Gaza, is what happens to the people of the Middle East and North Africa when the hope and dreams of a revolution, that is to bring about democratic political change, does not come to fruition. So what happens when a whole nation is geared, particularly as we know through social media and particularly younger people, when these people are geared to try and push for political change, and yet this does not come about. What does it tell us about the economic situation in these countries? Is democracy really letting people down, particularly, let's say, in the case of Tunisia, where it was deemed to be the model of democratization? But as we see today, the people of Tunisia are now not so hopeful about the democratic experiment in Tunisia. So something has happened where democracy as a promise did not deliver. And this is important for us because democracy as a concept is laden with perceptions of what it is like to be a free citizen, to be able to go to work without having to worry about the situation of your children. So these are some critical moments of our time that require further reflection. And I would say that because of the struggles that we have also seen through the, for example, Orange Revolution in the Eastern neighborhood, we are seeing some very important global struggles, not just about democratization per se, but what it is to be a citizen of a country that is sovereign and free. And this is not least, of course, in the case of Ukraine. So something organic is happening where the people are voicing what really matters for them on an everyday basis. And the longer term project of democratization is something that is put in the back burner, and some very survival issues like the economic situation in these countries is coming to the fore. So something is telling us that we need to go even more to the margins of society, where we look for voices that tell us something deep about strategies of change, but also importantly, what new forms of resistance are telling us, not least by way of nonviolence that many people are seeking, but of course, the legacy of violence itself. So there are a number of issues that are raised when we look at the region today. Now, something that may interest those of you who are working on social movements. Social movements usually promise something by way of a big change. So if you look at the feminist movement, for example, we see today that there's a huge discussion about whether we should have a feminist foreign policy, for instance. But when we look at social mobilization, when people are trying to fight for their right to be active citizen, to have a say in the political milieu, then we have seen what some might call a huge failure in the revolts, especially in the Arab neighborhood, but also for many of those of you who study the Eastern neighborhood. But something important, I think, has happened when people in Ukraine have been looking to what is happening in the Arab uprisings, and people in Egypt have been looking, at the Eastern neighbors. But if we look more globally at Brazil, for instance, or the Latin American region in particular, there is a global solidarity movement where what is relevant in one part of the world is being experimented in other parts of the world. So people are, so to say, taking politics in their hands and saying, it is we the people that need to really revitalize the notion of demos in democracy. What happens then with the second part, which is the political system per se, is what really needs a lot of hard work on. But first and foremost, I think we have to keep in mind that there's a huge legacy, not just of the former Soviet Union in the Eastern neighborhood, but also of the European colonial period in the Middle East and North Africa. So something needs to happen where at least an acknowledgement needs to be made by the powers to be of this legacy. What have we really left behind? And can we really change things for a better future for the people of these regions? Now, this brings me to the impact of the Russian-Ukraine crisis on the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm sure that many of you have read about this, but I'll just try to summarize what I see as some of the critical things that really impact on the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, conflict is something that the MENA has been branded with by Europeans for many years. So if we have heightened conflict in Europe, many are now talking about war in Europe itself. This has huge consequences for even European interests and strategies in the Middle East and North Africa, not least because many member states of the EU are now diverting most of their national budgets to defense and to support the Ukrainian people in really defending their sovereign country. This has huge implications, not just for European citizens, but of course for the EU's foreign policy and external policy in particular. So, you know, European policymakers think in terms of money. What this means is that money has to be diverted from previously, you know, budgets for the Middle East and North Africa, and now for our neighbors within Europe itself. But secondly, as you know, there's been a huge disruption of energy supplies. Now, this has meant that there's a huge price rise in you know, an exorbitant high price for wheat, which is a basic item for bread. And bread is something that is critical for food security in the Middle East and North Africa, where, for instance, in countries like Egypt, you still have bread subsidized by the government. So on the one hand, of course, we have some countries in the Middle East and North Africa that themselves are producers of oil and supply the Europeans with energy. But at the same time, you have people who are so dependent on their everyday for a stable price for bread. So we have a huge imbalance internally, but also, you know, at the European level. So this tells us something about leverage here. So what can the Americans and the Europeans do by trying to shift their dependence from Russian supplies to, let's say, more supplies from the Middle East, North Africa, and also the Gulf states? This is a question that we can discuss further. But my concern is that this focus on energy prices and food insecurity is really dangerously shifting the European focus on the already crisis point that countries like Yemen and Lebanon find themselves in. So we are dangerously, I think, hovering on a critical famine situation where, you know, most of the wheat that is actually supplied to these crisis countries is actually being brought, you know, usually brought from Ukraine. So there will be even worse consequences for the people of Yemen and Lebanon, who are already suffering so much from the crisis in their two countries. So while the Gulf states or the Middle East and North African suppliers cannot, I think, single-handedly replace the dependence of Europe on Russian energy, I think we need to try and secure some kind of greater leverage over the West. But as you know from discussions in Britain in particular, there is a game to be played between what we have been offering Russian oligarchs by way of the ability, let's say, to buy expensive properties, football clubs, and, you know, filtering into our democratic practices in these countries. But also, I mentioned the cases of Malta and Cyprus that have been selling European passports to Russian oligarchs. So something is happening where certain practices, in particular corrupt practices, have been really poisoning the very notion of democracy in Europe itself. So this gives us a lot of material to think carefully about, not just what this says for the Middle East and North Africa and the Eastern neighbors, but importantly for the core European space as well. And what I notice happening now across EU member states, but also at the regional level, is that we have these so-called renewed opportunities for transactional diplomacy. So diplomacy itself is changing. So now, you know, we are mediating in particular areas in Algeria and Morocco, for instance, to secure our energy supply, leaving aside the whole project of democracy support at the back burner. So clearly, European interests are foremost. And then, you know, perhaps if we have more energy and time and funding, we can think about the core needs of the Middle East and Eastern neighbors. So I'm very concerned, actually, that what we are seeing today is going to have a long-term impact and a huge devastating humanitarian consequence for fragile states, not least in the Levant and North Africa. And for me, this is really critical in terms of governance. So we know that historically, the EU has been lying in bed with many authoritarian regimes, and this is only becoming more entrenched, because these are the governments that have offered us a relatively, you know, level of security and stability. And when the people of the region have experimented with democracy, things have not gone in the direction that they wanted. So there is something here that is remaining for me a contradiction and a paradox. And I think that something dangerous is also happening in the dynamics I mentioned when it comes to rising bread prices, because this is I think, the core harbinger of more turmoil to come. So, the Arab revolts of 2010, 2011 were already written on the wall because we had bread riots in Egypt, for instance, before in 2006, 2007, 2008. And few of us read this writing on the wall then. But I think that, and I don't want to be an ultra pessimist here, but I'm very concerned that more dangerous revolts will be coming, and they will be even more bloody than what we have seen in the past, by way of course, the reaction of authoritarian regimes. So in terms of geopolitics, one of the things that we notice, as you know, Qatar has been quite important in, for instance, the establishment of Al Jazeera as the voice of the people of the region, which brings these voices much closer to Europe, for instance. But the US, for instance, has designated Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. And we see that the geopolitics is now playing out at hardcore security issues. Here I'm talking about military issues. So partnerships are being upgraded on where the West, the so-called West, deems this important. So with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the military domain has become even more important. And although the EU had an antitrust action against Qatar Petroleum, for instance, suddenly, with the situation of Russia and Ukraine, this concern has been put on the side again. And we see that we are playing this out in a very dangerous way, I think, where the Russian dependence, the EU's Russian dependence of energy is now, playing out. How are we going to work this out with our partners in the Emirates in particular? And, in spite of the horrendous murder of my friend Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, Saudi Arabia is again, an ally. And, the whole plot against Jamal has been silenced to retrench the importance we give to oil supplies from Saudi Arabia. So I see that we have a failure of democracy, not just in the neighborhoods of the EU, but there is an entrenched de-democratization in the so-called established democracies of the West, which is a very worrying development. And this brings me to Turkey, because we have some key regional powers that are really playing out the puzzle so well that further authoritarianism is being entrenched. So Erdogan is a very good case in point. He knows very well how to play, just like Russia, how to play individual member states against each other. And also how to play Europe against the Americans. So what matters for Erdogan is how he is perceived, across the Turkish nation. And the conflict in Ukraine is another opportunity for Turkey to re-entrench its position as a core NATO member. So, the manner in which politicians play the game is refocusing the attention from values and very much entrenching interests as really the critical reason why, we have engagement with the neighborhoods. So I would argue that this ongoing war in Ukraine, and I'm afraid that it will be a long and protracted war. I hope that I'm wrong, but I fear that it will be a long one. I think this is going to complicate Europe's position on the already established crisis we have in Syria and Libya, for instance, where Russia played a very important role and Europeans were completely silenced and put out of the equation. So Russia is clearly trying to reassert itself, not just as a regional power, but as a global power through the Middle East and also the Eastern neighborhood. And the so-called spheres of influence are not just the usual Eastern neighbors, but now we have an extension of the sphere of influence for Russia to include the Middle East and North Africa, which gives us a very important political, economic, and social map to think about. So as you know, I think now the figure is 6 million Ukrainians have fled to try and seek asylum in Europe in particular. So you know that Europe has already a huge fear of those seeking asylum, but we have also seen, as I said, a selective form of solidarity for Ukrainians. But there's also a limit to how many Ukrainians Europe can actually take in, not least, as you know, with the British playing about with different forms of asylum laws. So at some point, there's going to be a critical mass of pressure on the European solidaric movement to a stop. And Denmark has already initiated this by declaring a zero asylum policy for people coming from so-called non-Western parts of the world. But I think that we will see that with the Russian reinstatement of its spheres of influence extended to the southern neighborhood now, there will be a huge pressure for Europe to actually close its borders even more. And I worry about this development because this is not the kind of global humanitarian role that the EU deemed itself to be representing for so many decades, right? So there will be a shutting in rather than opening up to the European role as a global actor. And I don't need to say much about this, but we have seen, for instance, how the conflict in Syria has given us a lot of pessimistic outlook in terms of progress in terms of humanitarian issues, right? So the situation in Syria today is dire. You have an established program where Assad is working with Russian oligarchs to rebuild complete cities where people of Syrian origin have no possibility to return to because they wouldn't even afford to buy what previously was their own home. So we have money speaking huge volumes, but rights are really being embedded into the sands of history. And I move swiftly to the Iranian nuclear agreement, where again, the crisis in Ukraine has pushed Russia to a more disruptive scenario in terms of the kind of dialogue we saw initiated by Catherine Ashton. So we have to remember that what we see now is a blossoming of further insecurities. And here I am not just talking about war, but I'm talking about deep humanitarian insecurities that are being brought about by a rising economic giant with Russia and China, but I think more and more so China, having invested a huge amount in the Middle East and North Africa, but spreading its claws widely now to cover Eastern neighboring countries, and Russia moving along the same parameters of China, but in much more extreme violent ways through war. And human rights are, of course, these remain important for the Europeans, but I'm just concerned that there is a balance to be played out, and the balance is tilting more towards, as I mentioned earlier, the military domain. And we see that states are learning from each other. So Iran, for instance, and Israel have been cautious about making very clear discursive rhetorics on their position vis-a-vis Russian invasion in Ukraine, because of course they have other interests vis-a-vis Russia. So, I'm very concerned about this. And again, I don't want to be ultra pessimistic, but the scenario does not give us much room to be optimistic. So I'd like to conclude to leave some time for reflection and discussion. So all this gives us a lot of material to really take stock and move away from these amnesic moments of forgetting the past, but often history teaches us a lot. So I think we need to de-learn, but also unlearn a lot of the things that we have been trying to promote, at least the famous word promotion of democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. I don't think we have even the right to claim that we are promoting democracy when democracy is under threat in our own space. But it needs to be a kind of decolonization of the mind, where we think about what is it that we have done wrong and how can we improve our relations with the neighbors in the future. So an appreciation of some of the really hard fought and hard won resistance moments, but also the ongoing resistance, not least in Ukraine. What does this tell us about what people are really trying to fight for in the neighborhoods of the EU? And it makes me reflect about, you know, the notion of conditionality. Is this realistic when the EU sets conditions that cannot really be met, when people are constantly being governed by authoritarian regimes, but also corrupt regimes? I mean, I'm thinking here about Lebanon, for instance. But there is a set of moral hierarchies here. And, you know, Europe is no longer at the top of that, for sure. So while we have a persistent form of, you know, racism that is clearly visible, as I mentioned, not least in asylum policy and Europe's migration policy in particular, there is, you know, this technocratization of EU-Middle East relations and also relations with the East. So EU, you know, and Europe needs to be true to itself and claim outright what is it that we really want. And if, you know, the economic way is the way we want to go, then I think we need to have a rethink of what it means for people of the region to have an economic dignified life. And finally, for us students and educators as well, we also need to not only learn from those that bring so much to the classroom, but also de-learn and unlearn some of the things that we require to reflect on how and when we should contribute to this knowledge production. So I hope that gives you, you know, an idea of where my thinking is on the topic, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this excellent overview and really making it so vivid for our students. Before we move on to the Q&A, I think I want to stop the recording to give everyone a bit more ease to ask questions.